Olá, sejam todos muito bem-vindos e muito bem-vindas a mais um webinário da EJUG, a Escola Judicial do Tribunal de Justiça do Estado de Goiás. O webinário de hoje tem como tema Violência Doméstica e Recuperação de Traumas, um diálogo com Briana Barocas. O evento é uma realização da EJUG em parceria com um grupo de estudos sobre o direito das mulheres, que tem como objetivo estudar o direito das mulheres e buscar contribuir para o desenvolvimento das políticas públicas de combate à desigualdade de gênero e à violência doméstica. Nele, são abordados teorias, conceitos e fundamentos jurídicos, sociais, psicológicos, históricos e antropológicos que respaldam o direito das mulheres por meio de reflexões críticas, interdisciplinares e comparadas. Agradecemos a todos pela presença e informamos que as perguntas poderão ser feitas pelo chat do YouTube e serão encaminhadas à palestrante ao final do nosso evento. Solicitamos para que todos ativem a legenda automática do YouTube para a tradução da palestra. Participa conosco hoje a coordenadora do Grupo de Estudos sobre o Direito das Mulheres, integrante da Coordenadoria da Mulher do Tribunal de Justiça do Estado de Goiás, a juíza da Primeira Vara Judicial de Cidade Ocidental, Goiás, a doutora Isabela Bittencourt. Atualmente é docente permanente do PPG-ADM e do PPG-DP da UFG, professora adjunta da UFG. É coordenadora do Núcleo de Pesquisa em Informação, Direito e Sociedade, Infojus, da Universidade Federal do Paraná. Coordenadora do Grupo Interinstitucional de Pesquisa em Administração da Justiça, a AJUS. Membro do comitê organizador do ENAJUS. Como convidada, contamos hoje com a presença da doutora Jéssica Tragueto Silva. E como palestrante, hoje contamos com a presença da doutora Briana Barocas. Para fazer a abertura do evento, passamos a palavra para a coordenadora do grupo de estudos, doutora Isabela Bittencourt.
Bom dia a todos e o meu especial bom dia hoje é para a nossa palestrante, a doutora Briana Barocas. Hello, Briana.
Hello.
Thank you so much to accept our invite and join us today with your insights. It's so important for us to have you here. We know that you are very important to domestic violence, and we are so grateful, and so it's an honor for us to have you here. Jessica will read your resume to our guests.
Hi, Briana. Hi, Briana. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with Isabella and all of our guests. Thank you so much. So, Briana is a research professor at New York University Silver School of Social Work and serves as the co-executive director and chief research officer at the Center on Violence and Recovery. Her research interests is in trauma, resilience, and recovery have led to research on first responders, individuals, and families affected by domestic violence and survivors of 9/11, where her research has been supported by the Office of Victims of Crime, the National Institute of Justice, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense, and she is the recipient of the 2024 Dr. Gordon Bazemore Research Award from the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. Currently, she is the lead principal investigator of the Department of Justice of Violence Against Women's Restorative Practice Pilot Program Evaluation. She was the principal investigator on a National Science Foundation Innovation Corps team to develop an online capacity building platform for domestic violence service providers. She has 2 decades of experience in restorative justice applications to domestic violence and sexual assault in communities across the United States and currently serves as a member of the European Forum for Restorative Justice Working Group on Gender-Based Violence and Restorative Justice. So it's an honor to us, Briana. Thank you again
Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's an honor to be here with all of you today.
Can we begin now?
Yes. Should I share my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about restorative justice and domestic violence. Can I just ask, how does it work with the translator? Do I need to?
No, it's automatically. So
Okay.
you can go.
You can.
I'm good. Okay. So I'm going to be speaking about restorative justice and domestic violence. So for my presentation, I'll be focusing on some background information, applying restorative justice principles and practices to domestic violence. I'll then be talking about the Circles of Peace model, which is now a restorative justice evidence-informed approach, and I'll end with some lessons learned. So in terms of background, I want to start with some terminology and values in addition to telling you a little bit about my center at NYU. So the center at NYU is the Center on Violence and Recovery is a research center dedicated to advancing knowledge on the causes and consequences of violence and trauma and developing solutions that foster healing among individuals, families, and communities. We are a team of scholars, researchers, lawyers, clinicians, restorative justice practitioners, and survivors. To achieve our mission, we innovate, we study, and we educate. And for over 20 years now, we have collaborated with judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, treatment providers, and community-based organizations, victim advocates, and community members across the United States. And since 2004, we've been searching for the optimal treatment approach to addressing domestic violence. So I want to start off with, since I'm focusing on restorative justice, providing a definition of restorative justice. And this is a definition from Howard Zier, who's one of the, I would say, grandfathers of modern day restorative justice. And so it says, restorative justice is a process to involve, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense and to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and to put things as right as possible. So what is restorative justice? It's an approach to addressing conflict that focuses on repairing harm and creating meaningful change in the lives of those who have been involved in or impacted by an incident. It holds responsible parties accountable by addressing the needs of those who've experienced harm instead of focusing on punishment or retribution. It's flexible, it's culturally sensitive, and it aims to interrupt patterns of abuse. Restorative justice can be applied both within and outside of the criminal legal system. So I think this slide gives a good framework for what is considered traditional justice and what is restorative justice. And they ask a different set of questions. So within traditional justice, the questions that are asked are what law was broken, who broke it, and what punishment is deserved. Restorative justice asks a different set of questions. What harm was done? What are the needs of those involved? And how can the harm be repaired? And because we're talking about domestic violence and my presentation focuses on the context of the United States, I want to provide some terminology as it relates to domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and family violence. So in the United States, within the criminal justice system, domestic violence is defined broadly. It includes violence or abuse by one adult person against another in a domestic context. So that can be spouses, but it can also include abuse between an adult child and parent, violence between adult siblings. It can include elder abuse. And in some states, and each state has its own legal definition of domestic violence, it can include violence between roommates with no romantic relationship. So when I use in my presentation the term domestic violence, it is that broad definition. It includes both intimate partner violence and family violence. If I'm speaking specifically about intimate partner violence, I will use the term intimate partner violence. The other thing that I want to note is that domestic violence, a lot of times, is a term that's used interchangeably with intimate partner violence, but for the purposes of this presentation, again, it's that very broad definition. The other thing that I want to note is that within restorative justice, we try to move away from stigmatizing language and away from maybe some of the language used within the criminal justice system, such as offender and victim, and other possible terms that are used are the person who has caused harm or the person who has been harmed. However, I do want to note within a domestic violence context, even those terms are not always clear because it could be a dynamic of violence where people are causing violence to one another. And so it's hard to identify who is the person who has been harmed and who is the person who has caused the harm. And then I just want to highlight, as the Center on Violence and Recovery, we have values that guide our work. These are the values. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but we look for things that are adaptable, that are autonomous for the communities that we are working with, that are victim and survivor centered, that are trauma informed, that recognize that change is possible, but that also evolve over time. And then we also take a person-first approach and we use person-first language. So again, one of the things I said is this is evolving. As was mentioned in the beginning, I've been doing this work for over 20 years. So the approach that we use is living, it's constantly evolving. We welcome, encourage change and evolution. We use the lessons and the research that we've conducted from each community we work with to expand, adopt, and grow our approach in addressing domestic violence. I also want to highlight victim survivor agency. As I said, we honor the agency of victims. We believe victims should have choices within their healing process that honor their needs and desires. And in the US, our current criminal legal system does not necessarily allow for that. And we, as I said, we believe that change is possible in individuals, relationships, families, and communities. And our work has really focused on, within restorative justice, a peacemaking circle approach. And I'll get into a little bit more about the approach in a few slides. But we believe that circles are a powerful tool for healing intimate and family relationships. So now I want to talk about applying restorative justice principles and practices to domestic violence. So restorative justice, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, it's used around the world to address a variety of issues, and it can include a number of approaches. And as I mentioned, peacemaking circles is one approach. It may also include victim offender mediation. It can include family group conferencing or other types of conferences. It draws on ancient and indigenous practices employed in cultures all over the world, and it has a range of applications within communities, schools, workplaces, and the criminal legal system. So Now focusing on turning to domestic violence. So domestic violence is in every country, every community, every village and neighborhood. And domestic violence has also been linked to many of the larger social issues we face today. In the United States, more than half of mass shootings are linked to domestic violence, and also domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness. Most misdemeanor domestic violence offenders in the United States are court mandated to attend domestic violence intervention programs. These have traditionally been known as batter intervention programs, or BIPs. Sometimes this is after they've spent time in jail or prison. Other times it's in lieu of spending time in jail or prison. And there's a variety of popular models that include Duluth, Emerge, and Amend. And the other thing that I want to note, because my work has been in a variety of various communities across the U.S., every state in the United States has, as I mentioned, a different legal definition of domestic violence. Some states include that very broad definition where it also may include roommates. Other states it doesn't. The other thing is every state has different regulating bodies for offender treatment that dictate state standards and guidelines, including minimum treatment length, facilitator education, training requirements, standards for programs, and certifications. And this is important because, as I said, when we try to work with communities in implementing a restorative justice approach, we have to adhere to some of these state standards and guidelines in developing a program that's going to work for that community. So just a little bit of background on batter intervention programs in the United States. So there's over 2,500 batter intervention programs, and they proliferated in the U.S. following the passage of mandatory arrest laws. So this has been over 30 years that these programs have existed. Many of these programs have adopted Duluth model characteristics. So some of these characteristics include, it assumes that abusive men are equally socialized. It uses a didactic psychoeducational curriculum. It's guided by a feminist perspective. It focuses on changing sexist attitudes for the purposes of altering behavior. And it focuses on holding men accountable for the abuse. And in one national survey, and this goes back to 2009, and the reason that I want to highlight this is because our work in this area started in 2004. So at the time, around 93% of programs that were surveyed identified themselves as Duluth model oriented. So what were we at the Center on Violence and Recovery looking for? We were looking for an approach that did a variety of things, that would address one-directional, two-directional, and family violence, that did not re-privatize violence, that could be adopted to multiple cultures and family arrangements, that would provide voluntary participation by the victim. It also recognizes that cohabitation continues after a domestic violence incident has occurred, that children are involved, and that some victims want to separate safely with support. We also were looking for an approach that would monitor safety in new ways, could interrupt destructive intergenerational patterns, and we were looking for an approach that was effective, evidence-based, adaptable to the needs of local jurisdictions. So one of the things that I should mention is at the time that we started doing this work and subsequently, there's been a lot of research on sort of traditional batter intervention programs. And the research on those programs show that they're minimally effective, if effective at all. So minimally effective at best. Yet these are the programs that in the U.S. have been widely implemented. So that's why we were looking for an approach that really would get at a variety of the issues that I just highlighted, and ultimately that would be more effective than the standard treatment approach. So why restorative justice? Restorative justice recognizes that a crime or violence is a violation of people. Violations create obligations. Obligation is to put things right, and also recognizes that change is possible. So we asked as the center, could we apply these tenets to domestic violence crimes? So now I'm going to talk about the Circles of Peace model, which, as I said, is now a restorative justice evidence-informed approach. So the founder of the Center on Violence and Recovery is Linda Mills. She's the current president of New York University. And in 2003, she published a book called Insult to Injury. And in that book, she proposed the use of restorative justice for domestic violence. So she put forth in that book the conceptual idea of using restorative justice to address domestic violence. Subsequently, in 2004, the Center on Violence and Recovery invited international experts in both restorative justice, including John Braithwaite, and domestic violence to New York for a roundtable to discuss restorative approaches for domestic violence. From that, two models emerged, and from the beginning, there was always a recognition that this can be used for cases that are connected to the criminal legal system, as well as for cases that are not connected to the criminal legal system. And so for people who would want to use a restorative approach to address domestic violence and not involve the criminal legal system. So the Circles of Peace model, it's the first program of its kind in the United States to use restorative principles to treat those arrested for domestic violence. So it brings together, as I said, in a peacemaking circle approach, individuals who have been abusive and the victim, if they choose to participate. So victim participation is always voluntary, together with willing family members, support persons. So each party identifies a support person that they want to bring into the process, a trained professional facilitator, as well as circles trained community volunteers, with the goal of monitoring safety in order to seek a more effective treatment option. So Circles of Peace encourages dialogue about the current and previous incident. It uncovers gender dynamics and family history, and it creates longer-term change. It fosters individual problem solving, empowerment, community safety. It tailors safety planning, healing, rehabilitation to the cultural, religious, and socioeconomic needs of those involved. And as I said, it moves away from the stigmatizing language. As I mentioned, some terms that are used are responsible person or person harmed upon acceptance into the program. And it monitors behaviors through the use of what we call a social compact. So offenders are accountable to promises made, and they engage other circle members in the treatment process by committing them to supportive activities and improving family and relationship dynamics. So a brief history. As I said, in 2004, we hosted the roundtable at NYU in which we developed the model. But in 2004, the model was actually first put into practice. So there was a judge in Nogales, Arizona, which is a border community by the U.S.-Mexico border, who had been a judge in her community for so long that she started seeing the children of couples that she had seen in her court previously. When the children grew up and became adults, and the children were in their own intimate relationships, they were showing up in her court for domestic violence. So that intergenerational transmission of violence. And so she had picked up a copy of Linda Mills's book, Insult to Injury. She reached out to Linda and the center and said she wanted to implement a Circles of Peace model in her community. And so we worked with the community to develop and implement the model. And we also recognized the importance, if we were going to do this, of studying it. And because at the time, this was back in 2004, there was a lot of resistance to using restorative justice in the context of domestic violence. So we wanted to make sure that we studied it, but we also wanted to make sure that we did a very rigorous study. So we received a grant from the United States National Science Foundation to do a randomized controlled trial where we compared the standard Better Intervention Program to the Circles of Peace program. We then, in 2010, received another grant from the National Science Foundation. We did a replication study in Salt Lake City, Utah, comparing a hybrid approach that included some components of a standard Better Intervention Program combined with Circles of Peace to a standard Better Intervention Program. We also received a grant in 2012 from the U.S. National Institute of Justice to do some qualitative research that complemented the randomized controlled trial. And then in 2019, the Vermont State's Attorney developed a one-year Circles of Peace program, in part based on the promising findings we've had from our randomized controlled trials. In 2020, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia expressed their interest in the Circles of Peace model, and currently we're working in a number of communities across the U.S. in developing and implementing Circles of Peace models, including Texas, New Mexico, Oregon, Washington State, so really a number of communities across the country. So as I mentioned earlier, because the programs have to adhere to state standards and guidelines for domestic violence offender treatment, the program looks different in every community. So I just want to highlight some of the earlier communities that I mentioned in the previous slide. So in Arizona, first-time offenders, when we were working in Arizona, were mandated to 26 weeks of treatment. So the Circles of Peace program in Nogales, when it was originally developed, was a 26-week program where we did 26 weeks of Circles of Peace, focusing on the individual case and the individuals involved in those cases. So in Utah, it looked different because the state standards for domestic violence treatment in Utah required that before you can bring the two parties together, the offender had to do what they call 12 weeks of offender-only group treatment before they could do any type of conjoint treatment. So it was a hybrid approach in which first-time offenders at the time of the study were mandated to a minimum of 16 weeks of treatment. And so it was 12 weeks of Better Intervention Program. Then it focused on 4 to 6 weeks of Circles, focusing on the individual case and the individuals involved in that case. And then it also has different organizations that have implemented the model. So some of the organizations, if they've been community-based organizations, some of them are domestic violence treatment providers, as was the case in Arizona and Utah. But in Vermont, it was actually a restorative justice treatment provider. So in Vermont, every county has a community restorative justice center, and they were using restorative justice to address a variety of crimes and harms in the community. And at the time that we started working with Vermont, they were doing this for everything except domestic violence. And one of the things that was interesting is a lot of people asked, You were based in New York, so why was all of your work in like Arizona and Utah? Well, 20 years ago, or over 20 years ago when we were starting this work, those were two states and their state standards that allowed for conjoint treatment where you could bring the two parties together should they want to participate in a joint process. When we started working in Vermont did not allow for that, so it was prohibited to bring together the two parties. However, they made an exception for the pilot Circles of Peace pilot program, and then subsequently and more recently, Vermont actually changed its state standards and now allows for restorative justice in the context of domestic violence when you can bring the two parties together. And so in Vermont, the standard treatment was 26 weeks for if it was a batterer intervention program. So what they did was they designed a Circles of Peace model that was over a 26-week period, but it wasn't 26 sessions. So it included 6 circles, over that time frame, with 2 maintenance circles at 18 weeks and 26 weeks. The conjoint circle was allowed if the responsible person had completed 3 offender-only circles. And then what they also did was, while the offender was going through that process, if there was a desire to have a victim-only circle, they would do that before then bringing the two parties together. And then in Washington, D.C., drawing on both sort of our evidence where we had really significant findings at the 18-week mark, as well as just lessons learned from the other communities that we worked with, we developed an 18-week program that consisted of 2 community circles where we involved community members in the initial process, followed by 10 educational circles that were done in a group process with those who've caused harm, and then 6 joint circles that focused on the parties involved in that case. And it was co-facilitated by a domestic violence clinician and a restorative justice expert. So I want to get into some of the results from our studies. So as I said, the first study that we did was a randomized controlled trial in Nogales, Arizona, where we compared the standard batterer intervention program to the Circles of Peace only program. And this study, which was published in 2013 in the Journal of Experimental Criminology, provides evidence that restorative justice can be a viable and safe option for domestic violence crimes. The findings suggest that offender participation in restorative justice does not automatically pose a security risk per se, and it debunks the claim that restorative justice is more dangerous than batterer intervention programs in treating domestic violence crimes. As I said, in Utah, we did multiple randomized controlled trials. So part 1 focused on that broad definition of domestic violence, which in Utah also included violence between roommates. Part 2, which was a separate randomized controlled trial, focused on intimate partner violence only. And then we did a qualitative study that complemented part 2 of the randomized controlled trial. So the results from the first randomized controlled trial were published in 2019 in Nature Human Behavior. We had really significant findings from this study. So it compared that hybrid approach, so BIP plus Circles of Peace, compared to a BIP-only approach, and it showed that the BIP plus Circles of Peace resulted in over 50% reduction in new arrest and an over 50% reduction in severity of crime if a crime did occur. These are really significant findings for domestic violence intervention programs and also really significant findings for a restorative justice approach. So the BIP plus Circles of Peace is a more effective approach than a BIP-only approach, and it also showed that restorative justice is a viable treatment option for domestic violence crimes. We're currently writing up the article for part 2, but we also had really significant findings there for the intimate partner violence only cases, where again, the hybrid approach resulted in an almost 40% reduction of new arrests and an almost 40% reduction in severity of crimes if crimes did occur. And then the qualitative study highlights the promise of the model, the desire for participants to participate in treatment together, and the importance of a victim's perspective in treatment. And I just want to note also that, as I said, victim participation is always voluntary in restorative justice processes. And so we wanted to look at, when we had programs where the person who caused harm was mandated to treatment, what was the victim participation rates. And so we had, in the Nogales study, we had 62% victim participation rate. In the part 1 of the Utah study, with that broad definition of domestic violence, we had 42% victim participation rate. In part 2, that focused on intimate partner violence only cases, we had 67% victim participation rate. So this really speaks to the desire for victims to be involved in the process. The other thing is, as I mentioned in the beginning, the model has evolved over time, and we recognize the importance of a victim perspective in the restorative process. And so one thing that we've done is, as you know, victim participation is always voluntary. So if a victim chooses not to participate, we've worked with victim advocacy communities victim advocacy organizations in the community, and we've trained victim advocates to participate in the process of the victim themselves chooses not to participate, not necessarily to represent the perspective of the victim in that case, but of a victim perspective in general. And then finally, I just want to say that victim safety is paramount, and safety concerns are continually assessed and addressed as part of the restorative process. So I just want to highlight one quote from the qualitative study, which talks about victim participation in the process. And this is from the clinician's note from a final session of Circles of Peace. And it says, "The victim was able to participate in this final session, and she was able to provide feedback, context, and her perspective to the process. We focused primarily on summarizing the skills, concepts from all the sessions, which included the following: what boundaries, expectations look like for him and for his potential partners or anyone in his life, what enforcement of boundaries, expectations can look like, how he can communicate his wants, needs, emotions, thoughts to others in an effective way. His ex-partner was able to provide her feedback on his summary of what he has learned in treatment." So the other thing that I want to highlight from this quote is people don't necessarily still need to be together to participate in this process. You know, in this case, the victim was his ex-partner, but still chose to participate in the process. And people, even though they are no longer together, perhaps they may have children in common, a reason that they still need to, be in contact with one another, or in part, there could be a desire to participate just in terms of, victim healing, and it could still be a beneficial process. And so the Vermont study, I just want to note, this was, as I mentioned, a pilot program that was started in 2019. It was supposed to be a year-long pilot program. However, in the middle of it, the pandemic occurred. So rather than being a one-year pilot program, we actually captured 3 cohorts that went through the program. The first cohort started the program in person and was able to complete in person before the pandemic. The second cohort started in person and went to a virtual program because of the pandemic. And then the third cohort, it was a completely virtual program. And we have one article out so far, other ones that should be coming out shortly on this study that focuses on the meaning of community in circles. And so I think one of the things, as I mentioned, each community, the program looks different. And up until the point of working in Vermont, when we had community members participate in the Circles of Peace program, it had been one trained community member. Because Vermont, as I mentioned, had community restorative justice centers that were using restorative justice for a variety of other issues. They had a very engaged group of trained community volunteers. And so for the Circles of Peace program, they had 5 community members in every circle. And so one of the key findings from the study was the meaning of community in the Circles of Peace process. And so here's one of the quotes from a responsible person in the Circles of Peace program in Vermont, which says, "It's inspiring to see how many people from the community are struggling with the same issues and to see how they're able to kind of pull from their inner strength to get through some hard times." And then here's another quote that really highlights the meaning of community. "I'm actually thinking I want to volunteer in it once." It's actually interesting because talking with a bunch of people in the program, community volunteers, I think I can relate to them fairly well. Their backgrounds and experiences, I just see a lot of myself in them and what they're doing. And I think that there are certain issues in the traditional system, the correction system. And I just like the idea that someone, a community volunteer, is actually being provided an opportunity to legitimately change their perspectives and the way that they interact with people, and being able to help someone who is maybe at their lowest point in their life. That's pretty cool. That's a neat thing to be able to help with. So I want to end with some lessons learned from doing this work for over 20 years. So there's a lot of strengths to the Circles of Peace model. As I said, it can accommodate a variety of referrals, including at various points in the criminal legal system process and beyond. So as I said, our work originated in court-mandated treatment for misdemeanor domestic violence crimes where someone had been convicted and sentenced to treatment. But as we work with different communities across the country, they're implementing this at different points in time. It can address the broad range of cases that come into contact with the criminal legal system. It's an intensive process, so there are many circles over time. Victim participation is voluntary, and as I said, as the model has evolved, we've incorporated the use of victim advocates. Trained community members is a key component of the model. So there's also a variety of restorative justice approaches. One of the key things about using a peacemaking circle approach is that it allows for community member participation. And when a domestic violence incident happens, it has a broader impact to just the individuals involved and their family, to the community at large. So including that community component is a key thing. And one of the things that I forgot to mention, in our original study in Nogales, Arizona, when we looked at outcomes, we looked at subsequent domestic violence arrests and we looked at subsequent non-domestic violence arrests, and we saw a significant reduction in non-domestic violence arrests in favor of the Circles of Peace model. And one possible explanation for that is by involving members of the community in the process, it may tie people more to the communities that they live in and make them less likely to commit other types of crimes. The other strength of the model is that it's adaptable. We've had clinicians, mental health professionals who have implemented the model. We've had non-clinicians, we've had various system partners, and we have done this across different state standards. I think another strength of the model is that it really centers communities and is responsive to the community's needs and desires, and it is now an evidence-informed approach. So the center has partnered with organizations and individuals that are searching for more effective responses to domestic violence. I think one of the things, as I said, is we undertake education in the spirit of openness and flexibility, listening and addressing concerns, and supporting our approach with the best available evidence and research. And a great strength of the model is its adaptability, and we take care to address the safety mechanisms of Circle and to thoroughly hear and tackle those concerns. And we also try to manage expectations. So although we have found this to be a transformative approach and a useful process for individuals, families, and communities, it does not always end all conflict. It is not necessarily appropriate for every situation, and it certainly does not solve every problem. However, it is now an evidence-informed tool for working with individuals and families who've experienced domestic violence. Now, looking ahead, and as I said, our work in this area originated in cases connected to the criminal justice system that were, convicted of a domestic violence incident and sentenced to treatment. But in terms of where the field is at, there's a lot of interest in using it in a variety of different contexts. So most recently, the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Violence Against Women, has funded 11 pilot sites across the U.S. to implement restorative practice pilot programs for the next 5 years, and to provide, and they've also funded 3 national training and technical assistance providers to provide training and technical assistance to those pilot sites. And then finally, they also funded an $8 million evaluation of those pilot sites, and I am leading a team of researchers from across the country to evaluate the 11 pilot sites across the U.S. And so this study will build the evidence and data for victim-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive restorative practices addressing domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And these programs are community-based programs not connected to the criminal legal system. So, we're just getting started on this major initiative. This is a huge investment by the U.S. government in this area, and I'm really excited and thrilled to be able to do this work. And I just want to acknowledge all the awards that we've received, all of our research team members at New York University and the other universities across the U.S. and internationally that we've collaborated with. And then finally, here is my contact information, so please don't hesitate to reach out. If I can share any of the studies with you, I'm happy to do so if you have any questions.
Thank you, Briana. We are so proud of you and your team, your research team. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you for your contribution here today. And it was very important for us because the model that you use in the United States is different that we use here in Brazil. In Brazil, when we have a court mandate for the person that commit the crime, it's called Grupo Reflexivo, that's a reflexive group, and we don't have the possibility that the victim participate from this group. And see your insights, it's very important for us because maybe we can put the victim, because here we used to say that if the victim participate from the group will be a revictism.
Yeah.
But maybe will be better for both. So it's very important to see other studies about.
Yeah. And one of the things that I didn't mention that I think may be of interest for this conversation and to the point that you just said is one of the motivations for Vermont to implement a restorative process was right before the pilot program started, they had an offender who had completed the standard batter intervention program, and then subsequent to completing that program, unfortunately murdered his partner. And so that showed, and that was a process that where, the partner wasn't part of it. It was the standard batter intervention program. But if that was happening under the standard approach, I think it opened the community to trying something different because it was a real recognition that what they were doing was not working.
But there is a kind of crimes that you don't admit the victim to participate.
Is there a type of crime that we don't allow the victim to participate?
Yeah.
No, I mean, victim participation is always voluntary within a restorative process. So what I was talking about, the standard treatment doesn't allow victim participation. But in a restorative process, that's always voluntary, but you also want to make sure that you assess for safety, and that if safety is a concern, you may not bring the parties together.
Okay.
And in that instant, you may use like a trained victim advocate or some other mechanism that allows for a victim perspective to be included, but doesn't put, the victim from that incident in the process.
Okay. But when you allow the victim to participate to the group, will be after you do some circles of peace or not? Will be in the beginning, the middle, or
So that's been different in every community, but I think because we had really significant findings in our Utah study, which was what we call the hybrid approach. So there was like the offender-only component before there was bringing the people together for a Circles of Peace process. And so I think more and more communities are interested in this like hybrid approach where there's some component that focuses on like the person who has caused harm first before bringing them together for a joint process, and then also offering a parallel process where if the victim wants to participate in a victim-only process before coming together in a joint process.
Okay. It's so important, and I want to know more.
Briana, we have some questions from our guests. May I ask to you?
Sure, yes, please.
The first one is, how can restorative justice approach be adapted to better serve marginalized communities affected by domestic violence, such as racial minorities or LGBTQ plus individuals?
Right. So I think because it really, I think the problem with the standard approach is it's a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think what this question gets at is a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work for everyone. And so the standard Duluth model, when it was originally developed, was developed for intimate partner violence only cases where the person who caused harm was a male and the person who was harmed was a female. And what was happening was, depending on the community and the size of the community in the U.S., and there was also, I would say, like a disconnect between what the legal definition of domestic violence is and what the treatment programs were designed to address. So you had people who were, maybe in same-sex relationships who were being referred to a program where the curriculum was really focused on, as I said, intimate partner violence and heterosexual relationship. And so they're sitting there saying, this doesn't necessarily apply to me. And I think because it's much more individualized and focusing on the individuals involved in that incident and their relationship. It can address, different populations, different religious groups, different racial groups, and different types of relationships.
Thank you. Another one. Do you see restorative justice as a tool to confront systemic inequalities embedded in the traditional criminal justice system?
It can be, and I would say, the other thing that I think is emerging in the U.S., and you can tell me if this is similar, like in Brazil, is there's also a move, like a transformative justice, a movement in the U.S. And so I don't know if there's something similar is in Brazil.
Yes, there is something similar in Brazil.
Yeah. So I think that in part it's to address some of those like systemic issues.
Lucas, do we have another question? Just a minute. Thank you again for all of our guests here. Some comments to you. Congratulations. It's so much necessary to talk about how women need feeling supported after the trauma. Congratulations. It's possible to make the presentation slides available?
Yes, I can send you.
Yes. Thank you. I think it is.
There is no more questions. So thank you, Briana, very much to share your research with us today. And we are so honored. And it's very important for us to have you here because it's the way that we know more about other perspectives to do with the domestic violence. So it's very, very important for us to have you here.
Thank you so much for allowing me to come present today. I want to thank both you and Jessica. Jessica, thrilled to have you as a visiting scholar at the Center on Violence and Recovery at NYU, and looking forward to meeting you in person in a few months when you come to New York. But just, thrilled to be able to collaborate with you, to share our work, and to learn more about Brazil and the work that you're doing there. And I also want to thank you for allowing me to do this in English. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I am a dual U.S. Portuguese citizen who does not speak Portuguese. So I tried learning it. I was taking Portuguese classes pre-pandemic, and it all came to an end with the pandemic. And I think I forgot everything I learned.
Muito obrigada, então, a presença de vocês. Foi um prazer, doutora Isabela, estar aqui com você.
Eu que agradeço hoje a todos. Espero que tenham gostado. É muito importante a gente ter essa perspectiva, comparar o que a gente aplica aqui no Brasil, o que eles fazem e trazer boas práticas para o nosso país. Então, é muito, muito importante o direito comparado.
Thank you, Briana. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Em nome da EJUG, agradecemos a palestrante pela valorosa contribuição nesta manhã e as mediadoras, doutora Isabela Bittencourt e a doutora Jéssica Tragueto. Agradecemos também a todos que nos acompanharam até aqui. Desejamos uma ótima semana a todos.